Hey everybody, welcome to another episode here on our Week for Life. And today, the life issue we're going to talk about is racism, an important issue at this time in our nation's history for sure. And joining us from the Office of Ministry to African American Catholics is their director, Cary Dabney. Cary, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
No problem. Um, Cary, when our brothers and sisters, especially those in the African American community, are literally being shot dead in the street. I'm not sure how racism isn't a life issue, but yet there are some people who are hesitating to call it one. Why do you think that's so?
I don't know if I would say that individuals are hesitating to call it a life issue. I think that it's more they don't recognize it as a life issue. Unfortunately, because of the rhetoric and the language in our country, racism has often been categorized with politics. And so a lot of times people see it as a political issue, not a life issue. So one of the things that's important is that we identify racism as what it is, which is an issue of life, not politics.
Cool. Um, what are just some practical ways that Catholics in Northeast Ohio can begin to work on eliminating racism in their corner of the world, whether that's in their neighborhoods or in their parishes?
Well, the first thing that has to occur is that we have to acknowledge that we have a problem. The only way that you're ever going to change something is to acknowledge that it's an issue. And so we have to stop believing that racism is no longer an issue, but that it really is an issue and is an issue that affects every aspect of life in every community. So that's the first part. The second thing is, quite frankly, we have to have an acknowledgement of the issue and a commitment that the issue will be addressed, not only from those of us who sit in the pews, but we have to get it from our leadership. We're a sacramental church. Therefore, it is intrinsic within our identity to look towards the altar, to look towards our leadership for to help us identify what are the pertinent issues. How do we live out the faith? How do we do it? How's our beliefs implemented in our practices? The only way we're going to know that is to hear it from our leadership.
Yeah.
And so the leadership also has to have a commitment to the issue. If you do those two things, you'll start to see the needle move as far as our conversations about race.
Yeah. And that's part of our church teaching, right? This isn't just us making this up. I mean, the church actually teaches that racism is, a blight on society, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Cary, walk me through some. This might be uncomfortable for both of us, maybe, but walk me through some common pitfalls that maybe white people fall into when they start to talk about solving the problems of racism. Maybe with the best of intentions.
Sometimes a lot of times you may hear, I may have a friend of mine who happens to be white who will say, well, you know what? I've never seen race. That actually, believe it or not, even though I understand what they're trying to say, and I understand they're trying to come from a good space, but if you say I've never seen race and you're talking to someone who is of color, that actually is very offensive.
Yeah.
Because what that means is you don't see me. Because quite frankly, I am a particular race, right? I mean, that's part of who I am. That's part of my experience. So when you say I don't see race, that means you don't see me.
Right.
So that's one of the pitfalls. Another pitfall is when you may hear or they may justify jokes, they may justify stereotypical sayings by saying, well, that's how it's always been. Or you can't blame them, that's just how they grew up. That also is very offensive because what you're saying is we should tolerate racism.
Yeah.
And instead of, I guess, what would you want to say, bringing to light the pain that these comments make.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like somebody else's comfort is more important than yours.
Correct.
Right. My sweet little old grandma who has, racist tendencies, maybe to put it mildly, right?
Right.
Says something racist, and I'm willing to tolerate her because I don't want to put her in a place of discomfort, but I'm certainly willing to put you there.
Right. Absolutely.
Is that about right? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
I watched Father Brian Massengale the other day being interviewed by American media, and his book is one of my I don't want to say favorites. But it's a great book, and it really impacted me a lot. And you know, he was saying that the problem the church is really kind of threefold, right? Is that we don't really know what constitutes racism as a collective body. Like no one's really defined this for us, whether that's from the hierarchy or somewhere else. And so therefore we don't. The second thing is we don't know how to talk about it. And three, probably most importantly, many of us don't want to talk about it. So how might we overcome some of these issues and begin to have the kind of dialogue in parish communities where there's probably some real fear that someone's going to offend somebody else or might hold an opinion that somebody else might find problematic?
If there's one word that I would say we need to embrace to increase this conversation or the awareness of this conversation of race within the church, it would be the word passion. We as Catholics hold a lot of different beliefs. However, some of those beliefs we're much more passionate about than others. For example, I always like to use the example abortion. No one questions a Catholic's position on abortion. We do marches. We don't care about the uncomfortability of others when we talk about abortion.
Yeah.
We don't care about what justifications you may be able to come up with about abortion. Why? Because we have a passion for it. All right, as a tradition, we need to develop that same passion for things that deal with race. Because if we have a passion for it, then we'll be much more apt to proclaim how it is a sin and how it is offensive, regardless of what opposition we may receive from the world, just like we do with any other thing that we're passionate about. So I think one of the things that we can do is develop this passion. Now, how do you develop passion? Ironically, by having compassion. The only way you're going to develop passion for something is if you have compassion for the other. And you're going to develop that compassion by being radically honest about the current situation and by seeking out and encountering those that you normally may not encounter. All of that is going to relate to a passion for racism, which would then increase the frequency of the conversation and increase our courage to speak out against it.
Yeah, the word compassion means to suffer with, right? You know, at its root, you know, and that's probably what people are lacking in some ways, right? You know. Um, okay, maybe why don't we play this game to kind of close? You know, people talk about white privilege a lot, and I think I think I've addressed that in my own life in some ways, probably not to the full extent that I could. Um, but could you walk me through on what it means to have white privilege and maybe what it doesn't mean?
Let me start off by saying what white privilege doesn't mean.
Yeah,
When someone says or someone refers to white privilege, what is not being said is that individuals who are white will never have any issues or never have any social obstacles that they have to overcome. But what white privilege is saying is that race is not one of them.
yeah, that's right.
Right. So
That's
that in
absolutely
itself,
right.
that in itself is the privilege, right?
Yeah,
That we all have issues that we have to overcome. All right. We may have economic situation we may have overcome.
sure.
We may have family issues that we have to overcome. We may have past traumatic experiences that we're trying to overcome. But one thing that the white community does not have to deal with, on top of what is universal to all humanity, they don't have to deal with race being one of those obstacles. And that's where the privilege lies. And so when we're talking about fighting against white privilege, it's not against the individual. It's simply saying, can we're working towards having a system that does not use race as a standard upon which to either make determinations of procedures, policies, or laws. And up until this point, race has been mixed in as an ingredient along with other standards, other measurements in society. So when we're saying we're fighting against white privilege, it is simply we want to take race off the table. race is no longer a part of the ingredient of making those determinations.
Right. That's interesting. Like we were having a conversation at lunch. So Cary and I work in the same office, for those of you who don't know. We were having a conversation at lunch the other day about what were the conversations in our family like when we were talking about college when we were growing up. And I said, well, I was the first person in my family to go to college. And I said, so for us as a college was it was almost like a pipe dream, right? Like if you're lucky enough to get to college was always the thing. And you looked at me and you're like, yeah, it just never even was a conversation in our house.
It never came up, right?
Right. So that's one disparity just alone, right? But the second one, as you were talking, like race never was a factor in our conversations about education, but I'm sure they were in your family.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things when you mentioned before about why are we sometimes uncomfortable about talking about these things. When you say that, I'm going to be completely honest with you. No one in any community of color is uncomfortable talking about race because we've talked about race from the very beginning. It's just always been part of our conversation. The uncomfortability is generally from the white community. Why? Because they can literally go the majority of their lives, depending on where they live, and not have the conversation about race at all. So when you do have to have it and you're having it for the first time, particularly later on in life, it can be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, those are all different aspects of privilege.
Yeah. And when you add to the fact that I don't ever think about, and this is an experience I had with a priest friend of mine. When I leave my house every morning, I never really have the thought that that's the last time I'm going to walk out that door because someone might shoot me just for the color of my skin.
Right.
Where that's probably an experience you have every single day.
Not only do I have it, but when I say goodbye to my 4 sons, every morning, that literally crosses my mind. I'm literally praying that they come home safe that evening.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it's something for all of us to pray about, that everybody gets home safe every single evening, and that we continue to work as a people to have compassion, right? To see things as other people might see them, to be able to be willing to suffer with others. And so we realize that this is this is a time in our nation's country where we certainly should have been looking at these things for a very long time, but now in particular, we should be looking at them with great trepidation, if nothing else. Cary, anything you want to add before we walk away that we didn't cover? Too much, but
well, the only thing I would add is a scripture that I always mention when we think about these things, and that is the words of St. Paul. St. Paul reminds us that God through Christ Jesus reconciled the world to himself. But Jesus left us the message of reconciliation to give to the rest of the world. And so it is part of our identity as Christians to proclaim a message of love, but also a message of reconciliation, of bringing communities together. Racism is the exact opposite of that. Racism is the dividing of communities as opposed to reconciling. So it is literally the opposite of what the commission that we've been given as disciples of Christ.
Cary Dabney, the director of the Office of African American Catholics here in the diocese. Thanks for joining us, and we'll continue to keep you and all those out there who live in fear in our prayers.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
You got it. This is A Week for Life. Today's issue is racism, and thanks to Cary Dabney, and I'm Mike Hayes, and we will see you again soon.